it's just a complete other world which you never see, which I think is key for all insects. This amazing, amazing world which is just right under our noses or under our feet, but you just never see it. And I think that's the real fascinating thing about insects for me.
You're listening to Climate Curious, a podcast for people who care about the world but find the current conversation about climate change confusing, boring, or scary.
My name is Maryam Pasha, and I'm the director and curator at TEDx London and co-host of this podcast, along with the amazing Ben Hurst. Say hello, Ben.
Hey there, friends. I'm Ben Hurst, activist and advocate exploring what positive masculinities can look like, humble model, and climate normie. Oakley dokely. Hello, Maryam.
Hello, Ben.
How are you today?
I am excited to be recording this with you.
It is exciting. This is an exciting episode. And I'm going to start us off with a question because I want to know how you feel about insects. How do you feel about bugs?
Yes, it's a simple answer for me. I do not like them. I'm actually really arachnophobic.
Really?
Yeah, like seriously terrified of spiders. Like I have dreams, horror dreams about them. I'm not terrified of bugs, but I don't like them.
Because I don't like insects either at all. I'm not an insect person. Like, you know, there's some kids who are like, oh yeah, let me pick up the worm. Or like,
oh yeah, no.
I wasn't that kind of kid. I was like the kid who was like, Mum, can we boil those ants? Like, I don't like them. I don't want them near me. And I was trying to like trace it back in my mind and think about where it comes from. And I think my first memory of insects is like being stung by a bee, which is maybe where the kind of fear element comes from for me. But there's something about them that's like, they're just weird. Like, they're just different. Loads of them have like skeletons on the outside. They have like too many legs. They're like dangerous, maybe venomous. Like, I remember growing up and thinking, oh, if I get bitten by a spider, any spider, it will poison me. And I'm so
I feel
sorry.
like we need to put a trigger warning on our opening of this episode for people. I wish I didn't feel this way about them, actually, because I feel like it limits me.
Right. Okay. The only time that I've ever felt maybe slightly different about insects was when I watched Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Have you ever seen that film?
Oh, yeah, I love that.
Right? And you know, there's like, they all shrink down and then the giant ant is like trying to protect them and trying to save them.
Oh,
And it makes me wonder whether we are being slightly unfair. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you think
absolutely.
of insects as people, I don't know, this is a weird direction to take this in, but if you think about insects as people, I wonder if we're maybe judging them too harshly.
Why are we talking so much about insects, Ben?
Why are we talking so much about insects? We're going to be talking to an insect expert today. So, in fact, let me introduce our guest today. So our guest today is Will Hawkes, and Will is an insect migration researcher and a scientist at the University of Exeter. His work basically involves following insects all around the world. He is like a modern day explorer. And you know, like when you were little and you used to have dreams of like climbing mountains and swimming down to the depths of the ocean and discovering new species of animals. Will is that guy. So I'm going to hand over to Will to introduce himself. Welcome, Will, to Climate Curious.
Wow, thank you both. Yes, exactly. I'm pretty one-dimensional. I do love insects. But there's so many cool things. Like, Maryam, I know spiders aren't potentially your cup of tea, but there is one species called a nursery web spider, which lives around here. It's got gorgeous sort of brown and orangey stripes on its back in order to camouflage.
Oh my God, those are the ones I'm most terrified of.
You would have said that for any insect.
Any of them. But these ones live in grasses, so they're camouflaged for that. But they are such amazing mothers. Like, they carry their eggs in like this sort of very soft ball almost round with them. And then they'll make this web, which is very soft, and they make it sort of like a creche almost. And they put the eggs in there, they hatch, and it's this tiny little nest of web. I can see your face, Maryam. But then the mother will stay with them and guard them for like a few days until the little spiders are big enough to go out and make their own way in the world. And there's proper like maternal care in insects.
There's some spider propaganda happening.
Right.
Absolutely.
This is so interesting because I feel like, Will, you're doing such a good job of describing them as like these cute little caring creatures who weave like soft webs, and Maryam's face is like, no, none of you can see it because it's a podcast, but she's not here for it. Okay, so I don't know if you're going to be able to change our minds today, and that is not your job. You don't have to change our minds, but neither of us like insects, so I think we're going to start with the question: why should we care about
insect life? Really does like underpin everything. So insects are pollinators, they're pest controllers, they're helping in us get crops and things to eat. So birds eat them. The garden birds you have in your garden, which you love to see, the robins, the bleatits, the wrens, they all eat insects, and so they wouldn't be there if not for the insects. And yeah, they're kind of like this underappreciated huge biomass of just things that work for the planet.
How would you describe the role insects have with climate and climate change?
They're so important because with this changing climate, we're having so many new habitats, new pressures as well coming in. And insects, because there's so many of them and their generation time is so quick, which means they can really evolve quite quickly to exploit these new habitats. And so insects are really important because they're so sort of flexible, and they can continue to provide these roles in a way that potentially a mammal, which only has a few children, a few offspring over the course of its life, if an insect has so many, like a hoverfly can lay 400 eggs, because there's so many of them and have so many generations, they can just adapt and evolve to this changing climate. And so they're probably the ones that we can use to really help the planet going forward, because they're so adaptable.
This is really interesting to me because I feel like there's this like narrative, and I don't know where I've got it from, so correct me if I'm wrong, but there's this thing that like underpins my understanding of insects. Maybe it comes from like my understanding of cockroaches, where it's like they will just outlast humans forever. So is that idea of like cockroaches, or there's also like this narrative around bees, right, where like they are the thing that holds the whole world together, and I don't know if that's true or not, so I'm genuinely asking a question. Is it possible to like understate the importance of insects to like the ecosystem, or are they like, would you say like they're the pillar of everything, like they're the most important thing?
I don't know if you could describe them as the most important thing, but they are without a doubt one of the most important things. And it's all a case of them all working together though. So bees are obviously amazing and everybody loves bees there because they do so many things, and they are probably the best pollinators in the world. But then there's loads of different fly species, beetle species, which also are very important pollinators. And yeah, I think the fact that you often don't see insects is a reason that they're so understated. If, as you were chatting earlier about that film, if we're all tiny, tiny little things, then seeing these ants protecting you or whatever, then you kind of realise what a huge role these things are playing and how important they are. But although I'm saying all these positive things about how they've got such rapid generation times, there are so many of them, they can really help us protect the planet. Even though they can do this, I don't think they're doing it fast enough to cope with the rapid change that humans are causing to the planet. And so they are in somewhat, I don't know if crisis is too strong a word, but they're certainly under threat by our actions as humans. And so they do need a lot of love and protection.
So there's like this link between climate and insects. Or that sounds like a dumb thing to say, because I feel like what I've learned on this process so far is that there's a link literally between climate and everything. How does climate change impact? Does if the climate changes really drastically, does that mean that insects are like wiped out?
I think it is slightly more nuanced than a definite link, but there are examples of insects being directly affected by climate change. So, as you said, I work on insect migration, and we think because of climate change, because of warmer temperatures, for example, these insects, as they migrate, they're coming into an area earlier, potentially, and that might be out of sync with birds nesting. There's a study which looked at a species of butterfly called the monarch butterfly in the US, and this is an amazing, beautiful creature which migrates up and down America and overwinters in California and Mexico. And there's some thought that because of rising CO2 levels, the milkweed plants which these butterflies feed on are actually becoming fairly unpalatable or slightly toxic for these butterflies. And I don't know how much of this is actually affecting them, but these migrations and the populations of the monarchs are declining to some extent, and that could be a reason. But I think what I'm also saying is that we just don't know enough, and it's quite sort of incredible to me in my work, because these insects move in such huge numbers, but I'm still able to be this kind of Victorian explorer going to these places and discovering what they are.
Will you tell us a little bit, you mentioned, you teased us with this idea of Victorian explorer. Will you tell us a little bit about your work and what it entails and how you do what you do?
So, I absolutely love it. I'm so lucky. So, I grew up, and I'm from Northeast Wales, and I spent my life going around just grabbing insects out of the garden because they were so easy, and then showing them to my family, and that sort of inspired me, this ability to go up and hold these insects, which you can't really do with a bird or anything. And then I went to uni down here in Cornwall at the University of Exeter, did zoology, and then a PhD in insect migration, and it's this kind of wild, I can't believe it's work really. I get to go to two, because the insect migration seasons each year are in spring and they're in autumn. And so in spring and autumn I get field work, and go in the springtime we go to Cyprus, and in the autumn we go to the Pyrenees. And I spend 2 or 3 months in each location each year, and in the Pyrenees we're there because the insects get channeled through the mountains.
So while they're travelling literally around the world, is it that they're pollinating different things? Because surely if we as humans are screwing the planet up, or making climate change drastically in certain areas, or there's places where there's wet seasons and there's no longer wet seasons, or there's places where there's meant to be ice and there's no longer ice there, or whatever it might be, does that then stop the insects from doing the things that they're supposed to do, or do they just figure it out? What's the impact there?
So the impact of humans on insect migration, I think, is going to be pretty much entirely based on habitat loss. So if you imagine a migratory insect has so far to go, it's not worth just having a single nature reserve in Cornwall, for example, for these insects. You've got to have the food for them right across their migratory loops. And this food, 100,000 years ago, came from just wildflower meadows and things like that across the world. Mm-hmm. And even in the last 1,000 or so years, it would become from farmers and farming and having flowers throughout the crops. But in recent years, we've been using pesticides a lot, and that basically completely takes out the food for these insects, because even if you've got a field full of flowers, if they've been laced with pesticides, then it's obviously not great for these insects. And so habitat loss and the breaking up of these migratory flyways is, I think, one of the biggest threats that we see to these insects. And they have such important roles, as you're alluding to, Ben. The pollination is just, bees are really, really, really good pollinators, but a lot of them don't have the migratory behaviour. And although a hoverfly can't carry as much pollen as a bee, because there are so many of them, and the fact that they move great distances is really important. So if you've got a flowering crop in the Middle East, and then in Cyprus you've got another flowering crop of the same species, then this, say, keep with the marmalade hoverfly, will go to start from the flowering crop in the Middle East, and then pick up lots of pollen because it's feeding, and then will fly across the sea to Cyprus, and then land on the same species of flowering crop. And this, and then so it pollinates it. It allows the pollen goes on to this new one. And although a bee would stay in one place and pollinate just the flowers in the field from the flowers in the field, the same field, because this migratory hoverfly has moved such great distances, the diversity of genes contained within the pollen, which the migratory hoverfly is transferring, is far greater than the pollen that the bee would be transferring from the same field, because the hoverflies come from so far away. And this is so important for crop health. So there is potentially one gene for drought resistance in many crop plants. And so this gene could be easily transferred within the pollen. This is just theory and just a potential thought that we're having, and something we'd like to look at more in depth in the future. But the migratory insects could play a role in transferring the gene from the more southerly drought-resistant population into the more northerly one, and therefore helping the crop plant, or indeed any species of plant. And so, yeah, these insects could really have a very important role in combating climate change for these plants.
I struggle to think of insects and view them as an important thing in and of themselves. But when you start to talk about plants or crops that can withstand drought, for example, right? Like that makes a massive difference. That's so interesting that like insects are what make that happen, like on a global scale. And that they're so small as well, because you don't even see them doing it. So we literally don't notice that it's happening.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like they are so small, but they are so numerous. So where we go in the Pyrenees, we see, and Cyprus, we see millions of insects coming over in just the space of what really boils down to a week or so of peak migration. We see millions of these insects coming through. But that pales in comparison to the true number which is happening. The sheer numbers of insects coming through is just unreal. And this has so many important things. So all this pollination is happening, which is very important. A load of insects like our marmalade hoverfly are pest controllers. But I think the most important role that these insects play is one that we don't know anywhere near enough about. And that is the role of nutrient transfer. And so these insects, we know that they migrate in huge numbers, and we also know they're multi-generational. So when they get into an area they want to lay their eggs, then they will lay their eggs and then they'll die. And so their bodies go, if they're not eaten by a bird or something, then they'll go into the soil. And these insects contain nitrogen and phosphorus, which is really, really important for fertilizing plants. And because these insects move in such huge numbers, we think that this global movement of biomass is possibly the most, or almost certainly the most important terrestrial movement of biomass globally. And because all this nutrients is going into the soil, the plants might be actively relying on this regular seasonal movement of nutrients in order for them to maintain their own populations, in order for them to bloom or to maybe even grow. But we just don't know. We don't know enough about it. And it just shows the need for more people to get involved with insects, to take an interest in them and just see how important they are. Because really without them, if they're not pollinating our food crops, like you can see the real effects of what happens if the insects decline. So in China, they're hand pollinating their fruit crops in some areas because the wild pollinators aren't there. And so they've got teams of hundreds of people going along with little pollinator brushes, hand pollinating the apple trees because the wild bees and the wild insect populations are no longer there. But we can't do that for the entire world. Like, imagine how much money that would cost for, just from an economic point of view. And insects are playing this amazing role, but not yet fully appreciated.
I guess China is an extreme example, but if we're looking closer to home in terms of the research you've done or the areas that you've been working in, you still have these incredible numbers, right? Like that you're telling us, but are we seeing a decline? Are we seeing the impacts of the changing climate, whether we can directly correlate it or not? But what are you seeing in your research?
So in my research world, in the world of insect migration, there has been recently a paper out by somebody called Gatter, and he has been working for the last 40 or 50 years on insects in southwest Germany and the migratory insects going through the mountains there. And by comparing the insects which eat aphids, which is the hoverflies and a lot of the other migratory species which rely on crop pests or crops and things like that, he's found that those insects from the 1970s to now have declined by 97%, which is just unreal. So we were seeing, it's just huge numbers. This is like we've seeing maybe a few million, like under 10 million in the Pyrenees. But then that could be almost like 100 million or more, tens and tens of millions of things coming through, which just 50 years ago. And this is just showing that things are moving too fast for the insects to keep up with and keep evolving and adapting to. So they do definitely need our help. And the numbers are properly scary.
I mean, 97% is bad. Like that's not a small change, right? Like that can have major knock-on effect. It feels like insects can play a much more significant role than we've actually until now realized, because now that we're starting to see these ideas of like, if the birds are migrating, they're obviously migrating maybe for food, maybe these insects, then if we disrupt these patterns, that we can have quite major knock-on effects from the disruption of these patterns, which is kind of what climate change is all about, right? Is that like we don't know enough to know what the changes will mean, but they're probably going to be pretty bad. And 97% feels like it could be pretty bad.
There's a little bit of precedence, a little bit of evidence of what happens if we cut off this migration. And that comes from fish and the herring migration around the North Sea. And these herring, they migrated around the North Sea. They were just fish to almost extinction, that overfish in the North Sea. And then suddenly the shellfish stocks just completely collapsed off the coast of Scandinavia, and they didn't have a clue why this was. And then they realised that these shellfish and lobsters and things like that were all actively relying on the movement of herring, because they spawned off the coast of Scandinavia, and so they released loads of eggs, and all the crabs and shellfish and everything, they just went on and ate all the eggs, and that sustained their populations. And so this regular seasonal movement was relied upon by these shellfish, and so obviously this affected a load of human livelihoods and things. And then so that's exactly the same thing that could happen, or potentially is happening, with the insects. But also these herrings have, since we realised this and stopped overfishing them, they've started their migratory loop again and allowing the shellfish stocks to come back. And that's exactly what can happen with the insects as well. As we said at the beginning, they're so resilient because they lay so many eggs that they have possibly the best chance of any animal group of really combating climate change and adapting to it. So there's a lot of hope there, definitely.
And I think the way that I'm feeling at the moment is like, we're potentially stumbling upon a bit of a crisis here that we weren't even aware of, and that still maybe researchers aren't fully aware of, or there's more work to be done around that kind of stuff. And I'm wondering what role I, as Ben, living in London, play in this, and what things I can do to help the insects, even though I don't particularly like them. But what can I do? Because it's important, right? Like, regardless of how I feel about them, like, I think what I'm understanding and what I'm learning is that their survival is really important, and is also like much more intrinsically linked to my survival than I realized. So how do we help them survive? What can we do?
I genuinely think it's such an easy answer. I think the main thing is almost taking an interest. David Attenborough, one of his quotes was, "What you don't know, you can't love." And I think this taking an interest is just so important. People in the cities have such an important role, as well as everyone listening, and that's by planting flowers if you can. So if you're on your balcony, planting things like, so there's little plants like even chives and oregano, which you can eat, and they're great for so many insects. Little heathers are really good. And there's something called pulmonaria or a lungwort, and loads of bees love that, as well as other insects, borage as well. But also seeing dandelions in your, if you've got a little bit of lawn and dandelions are coming up, definitely don't cut them, because these like tiny little suns just attract the insects in. And just walking around down here in Falmouth a month or so ago, everything was crowding onto these dandelions because they're such important early spring resources. And there's been some research recently showing that there's actually a greater variety of bees in urban areas than there are in rural areas, because there's so many of these tiny microhabitats, because humans are doing so well at putting these plants on their balconies and attracting these insects in. And the people at the species list in the Natural History Museum's garden right in the middle of London is just absolutely insane what they get, because there's just such a variety of plants there, which is so important for these migratory insects. So doing that, eating organically, trying to maybe put pressure on the councils to stop cutting verges so much, and appreciating the wildflowers rather than just the flat green lawns is very important. It's just a complete other world which you never see, which I think is key for all insects. This amazing world which is just right under our noses or under our feet, but you just never see it. And I think that's the real fascinating thing about insects for me.
You know what I love listening to you, Will? First, I definitely want to become like a migratory stop for bugs. Like, I'm really into this idea of like using a tiny little windowsill to be like a stop on the highway of the migration journey. Given that I like spent so much of my life working on human migration, I feel like I should just get into this. Yes. But you know what I love, and I don't know if, Ben, you feel the same way, given that we both have a dislike of insects when we call them insects, is every time I hear you speak, Will, I feel like all I can hear is this incredible love and appreciation and fascination that you have for these creatures. And listening to you love them and be enthralled by them makes me want to know more about them. And I think that's what you're talking about, right? Like, there's the physical things you can do, but if you are, you know, it's just, it becomes easier to care about them when you hear about them talked about in such an interesting way.
That is completely the point. I don't know, going out telling your neighbours you had a marmalade hoverfly, had a cabbage white butterfly or peacock, whatever butterfly coming into your little patch of flowers, and then having it as yours, and then telling someone else, making them want to do the same thing.
I mean, yeah, like I would love, for example, for listeners to plant some of the species that you were talking about, the flowers and the oregano and the chives and the heathers and stuff. Take little photos of those plants and send them to us.
Yes, definitely.
Right, because we'd love to see what listening to this has inspired you to do.
Okay. It's time. It is time for our climate confessions. And now, it's time for our climate confessions. Let's fess up to the bad habits we just can't kick. What is the thing that you do that maybe you shouldn't necessarily be doing? What is something that you maybe struggle with? And I think the reason that we do this is because it can be really easy for us to think that there are people who have just got it perfect, right? Think that there's like a binary of either you're doing the good stuff or you're doing the bad stuff, and there's no in between. And I think actually the conversation is probably a lot more nuanced than that. So we're interested to know if you have a climate confession today.
Oh, there's so many things I do wrong. But I think the main daft thing I do is that I really love running, and I also have a favourite type of running shoe. And also the company that makes them are really, really nice, and they've got great customer service. But they also have a 6-month warranty. And so my plan at the moment, which has been going on for about 3 years, I'm definitely not going to name the company because they will never sell another one, is that I run as hard as I can to wear them out within the 6 months. And these are plasticky running shoes. And until they completely lose their grip and they break the canvas or whatever on top. And then just before the 6 months is up, I send a very sweet email saying, I love your shoes, they're so good. But unfortunately, is this right? And then because they're so nice, they always say, oh, it's fine, we'll send you another pair out. And it's been going on for like 3 years now, and I'm feeling really guilty about it.
You're a super villain. You're an insect super villain. That is so bad. No, that's fine. It's not so bad. It's okay. Thank you for being honest.
The judgment, Ben. The judgment.
I'm so sorry.
You're only judging Ben because you didn't think of doing this first.
I know. I'm definitely going to do it as well. It's on. But no, that's not what this segment is for. I'm not going to do that anymore. Thank you, Will, for sharing that. Maryam,
do you? Oh.
I was going to ask you if you have one.
I do have one. It's more of a conundrum that I'm facing, like a climate conundrum. So just as I was about to transition to wooden toothbrushes, I discovered electric toothbrushes. And now I'm in love with electric toothbrushes, and I can never transition back to a brush that I have to like manually move up and down, because why were we doing that for so long? Like, obviously a machine should do it. So now I'm this is like a plea for any inventors. Can you please create recyclable electric toothbrush heads, because I would like to not keep throwing them away. That's where I'm at right now, with these like moments where I know I've been tempted by the plastic version, and I know I shouldn't be. Oh
my gosh! Do you know what? I'd never even considered that was a thing. Like I use an electric toothbrush, and I hadn't realised that changing that is such a waste of. Well, I feel bad about myself, I guess.
Anyone
I thought I'd escaped it.
Yeah, anything you've got for us this week?
No, I don't think I have anything this
week.
You've
had a perfect week.
I feel like I've transcended to but obviously not, because using electric toothbrush heads is bad.
So you can use my confession this week.
Yeah, I'm going to use yours this week. But I think this has highlighted that I've got maybe some stuff to be more aware about, right? Like, maybe it's some of the stuff that I think is fine that's actually not fine. Which is really
I think we've all just got a bit of a plastic addiction. And it's hard to kick because the alternatives aren't there. But that's a whole other episode.
Well, we'll get there. We will get there. Okay, well, Will, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for sharing your passion and your joy and your love of insects with us. I can't say that I'm converted, but I can definitely say that I'm going to be making a little pit stop for some more insects in my garden, and hopefully they'll come and pollinate my plants for me, and take some pollen around the world to other places that I didn't know that they did. But thank you so much for coming and for sharing, and for talking with us.
Ben, you could come on an insect hunt with me whenever I'm in London. We'll get the Natural History Museum boys involved as well. And then you'll really see how nerdy and actually amazing it is. And then
I'm actually going to do it.
Go for a beer.
I'm so jealous. I'm
Maryam,
definitely coming.
It's so good.
As long as you protect me from the spiders.
Perfect.
Right.
No spiders.
Yeah.
Only other insects.
We're committed. We're going to do it.
We're going to do it.
Thank you. Oh. Thank you. I'm absolutely honoured to be on this. I love it. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Will. Thank you so much for joining us this week. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
If you did, please rate, subscribe, and share this episode with a curious friend. It makes it possible to keep making this amazing content for you.
Oh, and slide into our DMs at TEDx London and let us know which climate extraordinaires you'd love to hear from next time. Oh, and don't leave yet. We wanted to tell you a bit more about who made this podcast possible.
Yeah, we did. TEDx London's headline partner, City, has been supporting us for the past 5 years to bring world-changing ideas to the TEDx London stage. And now they're taking it to the next level by making this podcast possible. Thanks, City.
But wait, that is not all.
No, this podcast was produced by the amazing Josie Coulter.
Curation and research by the genius Tara Cooper.
Artwork designed by the visionaries that are Sabrina Russo and Rebecca Mingus.
Mixed and engineered by the iconic Ben Beheshti, aka The Falcon, who also composed our banging theme tune.
Presented by me, Maryam Pasha.
And by me, Ben Hurst. Stay curious.